From the WLNS newsroom, this is Brad LaPlante. It is Wednesday, December 10th. COVID-19 left a lasting impact. Inside Michigan schools, teachers and students are still grappling with gaps in learning, especially in literacy, though some progress has been made. On today's show, I'll speak with Associate Director Tara Kilbride at Michigan State University's EPIC program, or Education Policy and Innovation Collaborative. We'll discuss a recent study showing how MSU's students are doing. That's ahead on In Michigan.
EPIC is an independent, nonpartisan education policy research center. We're housed in the College of Education at Michigan State University, and we work closely with the Michigan Department of Education, but also various organizations locally and at the state level on a number of different education issues. And we have a fully partner-driven research agenda, which means that our research areas and topics kind of shift over time to meet the needs and answer the most pressing questions. In general, we see kind of a mix of promising improvements and also some enduring challenges. Early in the pandemic, we saw large declines in achievement in both math and reading, and generally relatively flat recovery in the immediate years that followed. But then math scores across all grades started to really accelerate in the last 2 years. We show in this most recent report that not all of that growth has been lasting. So there have been larger than typical decreases in scores in between the end of one school year and the beginning of the next one. We're not sure exactly why that is, but it could have to do with the types of strategies and what's driving those large improvements during the year, but not necessarily allowing students to come back at the same level a couple of months later. But in general, it's been an upward trend in math. It's just not continuous in between school years. In reading, recovery has been much more flat in comparison. As I was explaining before, this is based on just average scores. Average reading performance really hasn't changed much since the early stages of the pandemic. But we're seeing some improvement in gaps between higher and lower performing readers in upper grade levels, but little change at all in elementary grade levels. Math, on the other hand, the improvements that we're seeing are consistent across the full range of achievement levels. So the gaps are still wider than they were before the pandemic, but all students are improving to similar degrees.
And so this report comes out, right? It is, from what I understand, I'm pretty sure it is the seventh EPIC report. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
People have been talking about around the state about Michigan's educational gaps, and like especially with English language arts. How do you think that conversation fits into your findings, or does it affirm them?
We certainly see evidence of those gaps in our findings, and it's especially relevant to the conversation about impacts of the pandemic and pandemic recovery, because students' experiences during the most disruptive stages of the pandemic exacerbated a lot of these gaps that have existed for a long time. So part of that recovery is trying to narrow those gaps at least back to their starting points as of just before the pandemic. But it is a longer term problem and something that's existed for a very long time.
COVID was really, I think, hard for a lot of people. I think just in so many ways, it's become such just the defining point of, like when I was growing up, I graduated high school in 2014. I was born in 1995. And I think that I think about like what defined our generation in terms of like just, pop culture, cultural things and whatnot. And what comes to mind is like technology, the age of, like email and, phone usage and things like that. But now, I could not imagine having, my entire like growth and development stunted for, I mean, I think a lot about the kids who graduated in 2020, but not only that, the kids who, were in fourth, second, third grade, like had to learn and do things during that time. What was there anything specific that you found that, like, what were the biggest like impacts as far as COVID goes?
Well, you're certainly right that not everyone was affected equally. I mean, we see effects everywhere, but the extent of those effects are very uneven. So historically underserved areas, urban areas, lower income areas, rural areas with less access to reliable broadband internet are some of the contexts where we tended to see larger effects. Recovery has also been uneven, and I think a lot of those disruptions and those kind of formative impacts that you were talking about were particularly acute for students who are in lower elementary grades, who are in these really foundational levels of their literacy development, where that's one area where we're just not really seeing upward trends the way we would like. We're seeing a lot of improvement in math across all grade levels. We're seeing some improvements in reading in upper grade levels, but these younger students in reading who are in lower elementary grades during the most disruptive times, that's an area where we're still seeing a lot of continued struggle.
I covered the M-step
Mhm,
scores when those came
mhm,
out and were released, and I did a lot of some data projects about, and just trying to analyze and really see what a lot of that data and those scores mean. Um, and you saw a lot of gaps, especially among third and fourth graders
mhm,
with their literacy levels.
mhm.
Is this a trend that we've been seeing for quite some time, or was it like truly like profoundly impacted by COVID?
Both. Uh, so we've seen a kind of concerning downward trend in early literacy and ELA scores for younger students in Michigan for a long time, many years leading up to the pandemic. A lot of those trends are what led to things like Michigan's Read by Grade 3 law, which of course predated the pandemic by several years. But the pandemic did exacerbate these issues, where in math, it was more of an abrupt change during COVID, but less of a long-standing downward trend in the years leading up. So that's certainly playing into why recovery hasn't looked the same way.
I'm wondering too a little bit about reading levels. I mean, specifically because it's kind of been the headline throughout the year of like Michigan's education scores and whatnot. And Michigan's kind of hovered around, I want to say the 49th percentile, or thereof, since around 2021, from what I understand. I guess I'm wondering, are there any leading hypotheses for maybe why recovery has stalled versus like something like math, for example?
It's stalled recovery in terms of average scores, but I guess it's a little more complicated than that. And that might point to the different kinds of strategies that are happening in math as opposed to reading. So, in the place where we do see improvement for the grade levels, other than those younger grade levels I was just talking about, for students who are a little bit older, we're still seeing stagnation in average reading scores. But if you look at the distribution, the spread of reading scores, we can see some evidence of improvements among the state's lower scoring readers, at least in those higher grade levels. So the gap between the students who are lower performing and higher performing that got much bigger during early stages of COVID is starting to improve, even though the average scores aren't. So that could mean that the strategies that school districts and schools are using in reading are maybe more specifically targeting students who need the most help, as opposed to something that's school-wide, district-wide, that affects all students, which would explain the types of improvements that we're seeing in math. So it could just point to different strategies.
There is a lot of talk right now in next year's governor race for Michigan to revamp our education system, right? Regardless of what that looks like, right? So, like, one example is you have independent candidate Mike Duggan, who, right, was who's the mayor of Detroit until the end of this year. He has come out with a huge plan to like revamp our education system. And then you have like a Republican candidate I spoke with, Tom Leonard, who he's from DeWitt. He was former Michigan Speaker of the House. He had also similarly said similar things about revamping, and he almost, I don't know if you're familiar with Mississippi and how they revamped their education system, and now I don't want to say, I mean it's up near one of the best in the country in terms of education. Do you see? I guess I'm wondering more about policy, and are there certain like policies that maybe impact the way that or the what Michigan has struggled with in terms of education?
I'm not sure that I can speak to specific policies that are, shaping what's happening in Michigan. I think there's a lot we can learn from other states that have been having success. Mississippi is a great example. So we'd like to understand better exactly what's driving those massive improvements in that state, but also understanding our different contexts and what may or may not extend from a Mississippi to a state like Michigan. We're just very different places. Um, there's Michigan has really been prioritizing early literacy for a long time, and there's been a lot of effort and resources put into things like the Read by Grade 3 law, and more recently the dyslexia legislation. Um, where it's not that we've been under addressing or not putting enough attention to this issue. It may be a matter of needing the right strategies or needing to give those strategies the time that they need to drive improvements. So where we are right now, it may have looked different with all of the supports built into the Read by Grade 3 law had the pandemic not happened during critical stages of that law's implementation, for instance.
I want to go back to something that I think we spoke about a little bit earlier, which is like access to education. So like, I'm thinking,
Mhm.
right? So poor communities are probably going to have worse academic performance than communities with more resources. And I mean, that doesn't just go for poorer areas, but I'm thinking like even rural areas who might not have access to internet at home, or
Mhm.
things of that nature. How did that play into the report that you guys released?
Well, we've shown, I'm not sure if we addressed it in this specific report, but we have in definitely in some of the reports in this longer series, that the school districts that were that had to stay remote for longer in earlier stages of the pandemic tended to be places that were disadvantaged in other ways already. So it's not just a matter of maintaining those gaps that existed before, where these districts were always disadvantaged, but that the degree of that disadvantage grew because they were more likely to have local outbreaks that forced them to stay remote for a longer amount of time. In some of our earlier work during the pandemic, analyzing information that school districts provided about how they were continuing instruction at the end of the 2019-20 school year, how they were reopening the next year, and what was changing from month to month across the state. We saw that there was just really wide variation in what learning looked like. So even if two school districts were operating fully in a fully remote format, that might in some cases mean that every student is logged on just like we are right now, speaking face to face, just like your typical classroom, with some added distractions and less of a controlled environment, but direct interaction with your teacher, with your classmates. In other cases, students may have been just watching a video, working through a packet of worksheets, and then submitting their work for somebody to come to send back to them with comments and feedback some undetermined amount of time later. And then there's everything in between those two extremes. So there was just this huge variation in what those experiences looked like, even just among the places that were remote. And then adding to that is the places that were maybe partially remote, partially in person, and places where operations didn't change as much at all if they were able to stay open really for most of the 2020-21 school year. So that just created these much wider gaps than before. And the gaps between districts with different modes of instruction are the gaps that have lasted the longest in later years. So that's where we see the least evidence of a shrinking of gaps is between the districts that had different instructional modalities. One important finding that we talked a little bit about improvements in the gaps between higher and lower performing students, but I don't think we talked as much about how those gaps grew in the earliest stages of the pandemic and what that means. So, despite those improvements that I've referenced, it still is the case that there's just more variability in students' learning levels and learning needs now in both math and reading than there was, or that would have been typically expected before the pandemic. And that has a lot of implications for instruction, for school operations, and for what students need. It's a different job for a teacher to teach students at a very wide range of levels than it is to teach students in a narrower range. That could mean that the curricula, the instructional resources that schools and districts were using in the past aren't quite right for where their students are today. It could mean that they need more instructional aides, paraprofessionals. It changes a lot of the needs. It makes it difficult to compare where they are now or where operations are now to what they would have been just before the pandemic because their needs aren't necessarily the same. So it's just something that I think is really important to conversations about moving forward and what recovery looks like, because it's not necessarily just a return to the norm before, since the needs are so different now.
Tara Kilbride is the Associate Director of EPIC at Michigan State University. You could read the report in our show notes or on our website. Next, I'll speak to a middle school teacher in Cadillac, Michigan, to see what it's like inside the classroom. Stay tuned for that next. So, Carlie, you are an educator. First of all,
Yeah.
can you tell me what you teach, and can you tell me how long you've been teaching?
Yes. So right now I teach eighth grade language arts, and prior to that, I was teaching, ninth grade, 10th grade, and 12th grade language arts. Um, and I've been teaching. This is my 10th year teaching. So I've run the gamut of eighth through 12th grade.
Right, absolutely. And you have kids as well, right? Can you tell me how old they are?
Yes, I have an 11-year-old son and a 4-year-old son, and another one on the.
What would you say like were the biggest challenges that you faced when trying to teach through what a miserable time that I do not want to remember?
um, oh boy, man, that is loaded. But I, I mean, the initial challenge was just getting over the hump of like, okay, well, how do I take all of my like normal everyday awesome like ironed out curriculum and make it accessible online? And I think that that was the first thing that a lot of us just were like, okay, well, how do we engage kids? How do we get them having the conversations with each other? How do we collect evidence of learning? Like there, it was just a very trying time in terms of like just brain power. Like, okay, well, we've got all this good stuff. How do we alter it and make it accessible and like, oh gosh, and how do we ensure that it's effective? And I mean that was those were questions that came along later, like, right, how effective is this? Is it really working? And are we meeting our kids? Another problem, of course, was just accessibility, making sure that kids had access to online learning. That was a huge concern. I remember masking up and going and helping kids. Like we were delivering Wi-Fi routers to some families that didn't have them, and Chromebooks. We all didn't know what we were dealing with, and we're trying to like stay separate from each other and walking up to cars with, you know, gloves and masks on. But like those were the initial challenges as a teacher. But I think the biggest challenge, and the one that I think still strikes me as just being like the most daunting, was just watching some of my kids' mental health just absolutely plummet. Like those kids were just so. Um, and I'm talking about my high schoolers when this was happening. They were just so eager for interaction that sometimes when we get our Zoom meetings to actually happen, right? And like kids show up, a lot of the times it was just because they wanted to see each other. They wanted to interact with each other. They wanted to make sure everybody was okay. And they had FaceTime, they had text, but like um we lost that classroom atmosphere that we loved so much. So I would say that was the biggest thing. Those were the messages I was getting, right? Like the kids would be like, "Oh man, Mrs. Rockwell, thank you so much for like hosting class today." I was like, "Well, we needed it." But but sometimes, I think the other challenge was like tracking that. So many kids, um, there were so many kids, especially my graduating seniors. I'll never forget just being like, I think this is it. Like maybe there's no point in going. You know what I mean? So yeah, mental health, accessibility, and just changing everything were the biggest struggles.
Yeah, that's tough. I just spoke with an MSU researcher, and she was telling me about the rural challenges in because when I was covering the M-step scores from
Mhm.
that they get released every year, right? And we're focused in
Right.
Lansing, so I'm really focused on the surrounding areas. And I think that, just, it's not like we have a staff of people who are able to sift and analyze through all of this data. In our newsroom,
Mhm.
just I'm speaking from personal experience, right? So we focused a
Mhm.
lot on like the city of Lansing, so the Lansing school district, and we focused on maybe a couple outside of the city of Lansing, but I think
Mhm.
that the rural area surrounding the area kind of gets, not necessarily focused on as much, just I mean specifically because we're not focused on it. And so this researcher brought up an interesting point in that, like, it's not because, the storyline that I had been making is that, in Lansing, it's a much poorer school district. And so it's not
Mhm.
going to have the access to some of these, that other districts around Lansing have. And so the test scores are going to be lower because of that. And you
Mhm.
see that a lot in rural areas. And as someone, right, you teach in a rural area, I mean, that must be almost like an everyday challenge is, whether people have, I don't know if a lot of people have internet access or, just access to learning
Yeah.
material in general.
Yeah, so like, and it's interesting because during COVID, I was in a different state at that time teaching. We were actually in North Texas at that time. One of the big issues in terms of accessibility was not even necessarily the rural like families. It was more like there was such a, you think about the poor feeling poorer. Well, when you have um students, demographically in your school district who simply just they don't have the money, can't afford, the laptops or the Wi-Fi connectivity, or that was the primary problem there. Now, of course, where I'm teaching now, as you were suggesting, um, oh yeah, like we have areas in my current district where um, it's still really difficult for kids to have like Wi-Fi access, or there aren't like they're talking about all this like satellite internet and things like just because that's what might be available, but it's very different. But you do have to consider, like, when we went into COVID, there were those considerations that um were definitely highlighted: the haves, the have nots. Like, how do we make sure that there's some equity here? Because it felt like, well, it was all overwhelming. How do we make sure everyone has access?
Right. And since COVID, right? I mean, we're a few years removed, but like, are you still seeing the
Mm.
gaps, like in, maybe stuff that maybe, and I know you taught a different subject, but maybe stuff that, you know,
Mhm.
10 years ago, these kids would have already been, known by now or, performed
Yeah.
better.
Yeah, unfortunately, I feel like there is well, there's this idea of like learned helplessness. I think a lot of times at least in my own experience, we've got some kids who, through the duration of COVID and COVID learning, there was this um, this apathy, this I don't have direct connection with somebody, so I don't have to ask questions or it'll get done for me, or um, you know, instead of like problem solving, finding out a different route or asking for clarification, right? It was just like, well, I guess I'll just wait until next year, or I'll wait until I'm in person, or I'll wait, and unfortunately, and even in conversations with kids, they'll recognize that, right? The young people I have, um, this awesome responsibility, and honor of teaching, they communicate about that. They'll open up, wide open, be like, Ms. Rockwell, I didn't do anything when I was online. I didn't. Um, but virtual learning, I think COVID also opened the doors for that. There have been some kids who've been like, I don't know, learning really worked well for me. And that's been an interesting conversation with those kids too. But I think overwhelmingly, um, it, the issue we're seeing now, especially with, being in the language arts, there's a lot of apathy and disinterest in reading. We just have so many other things we want to do with our time, and so many more fun and engaging things. And um, unfortunately, I think we lost a lot of readers or kids who um, could have had some of those roundtable reads. Like I think about that with my own 11-year-old, right? Like how um, I think that some exposure to reading and the power of story got kind of lost in COVID because we didn't have pick your circle to sit down and let's read this story together. It was looking at a desktop computer or a laptop and having your teacher read a story. It was just it stole some of that um, love of education and like learning and from kids. So we do see some gaps in learning in the classroom, and I think um, aside from already differentiating to help kids meet in all the different places they are, now we're also riding that wave of just COVID variants. But yeah, I think the biggest thing is just, yeah, we really just want these kids to feel confident, competent, and happy at school. And COVID made that journey a little harder. But yeah, I think we're finally getting to a point, at least in my own classroom, where some of that learning loss or some of that socialization and the things that got kind of interrupted are finally maybe making their way out, but we're still working at it.
That's it for today's show. Tomorrow, we'll discuss vaccine policy with Michigan's top doctor. I'll see you then.